Finally I made it. I'm live. This is always tricky. Somehow, sorry, when I start these sessions, then sometimes it starts a new stream and not the event that I scheduled. I don't know what's going on there. I have to figure that out, but it's fail forward. It's failing and learning, right? So I will try to schedule these events in the future more often so that you know when they are coming. And I try to uh, I try to use the scheduled event instead of just opening another one and going live on that. So sorry for being late. Um, that's just me learning. And let's dive into the topic of today. I picked the topic of user stories. I think we talked about user stories before. And so with user stories, there are a lot of misunderstandings I always see when having user stories. That's better. And I want to talk about 3 of these big misunderstandings today. And the first misunderstanding, or let's look at the 3 before we dive into it. So the first misunderstanding, big misunderstanding with user stories is that user stories would be a different way to format your requirements. It would just be a different format for requirements. Yeah, you just take your old requirements and you transform them into the user story format, and then you have user stories. That's wrong. That's a big misunderstanding that I see over and over and over again. The other one is, the second one is that user stories would be about how to write good user stories. But user stories are not about writing. That's another big misunderstanding. And the last one is connected to that. What if a user story becomes too big? Some of you might know a user story must be small, like ideally just a few days of work. So we have bigger items that take more work than just a few days. And these items are called differently in different contexts. Some call them features, epics. There are terms like capabilities thrown around. And I want to especially look at the term epic because I think there's also a huge understanding about epics and that they are kind of like just a category or a group of user stories, and they are not. So the 3 things. First misunderstanding, user stories are just a different format to write your requirements. The second misunderstanding is that user stories are about writing. And the third one is that epics would just be a group of user stories or a category of user stories. Let's tackle these one by one. Because we want to be... So trying to get a little fun in that. To really be agile, it's not enough to have user stories just be a different format. Let's start with that one. User stories as just a different format is a huge misunderstanding. The idea, and it's often taught that way, and I can't blame people who maybe a little bit, but not too much. I can't blame these people too much who teach it like that. When they talk about user stories, and I was guilty of that in the past as well, we usually look at the user story format. The thing that has the 3 parts as a role. I want to do something in order to get some benefit or some value. That's the typical user story format. And then underneath we have a list of acceptance criteria, kind of like a checklist to know when the user story is done. Not to confuse with the definition of done, but that's another topic. So that's how user stories are often explained. And while there is certainly merit in that format, I like that format because it forces you to think about the role and it forces you to think about the benefit that the user story is supposed to deliver to your customers. it can distract from what user stories actually are. Because what happens, or what I see happen a lot, and let me quickly, because I don't see anyone in the stream yet, let me check whether it's really streaming and working and online, and because this is a different way I use today to stream, and I'm not sure if it works. Okay, let's see. Yeah, it works. Oh, okay. Here I see lots of people joining. It's just not reflected in my UI. So let's get back to that. A different format. The format is great. It forces you to think about the business value, about what you really deliver to the customer. And it also gives some context with the role. The role, for example, is interesting if you think about, let's think about something like export an invoice as a PDF. That could be in so many software products, or so in other products. It could be a story or a feature, exporting an invoice. But then, if you ask about who wants that export, it completely changes what it is. If the export is done by the end user, it's certainly different than if the export is done by your customer support. So the role is important. And then also the benefit, like why do you want to generate that PDF invoice? Likely for, I don't know, for the IRS, for purposes there. Maybe that's the primary goal. And maybe if that's the primary goal, there are different ways to do that. There might be, you could maybe generate electronic versions that automatically sync with your accounting software. So it helps to think about the value you create instead of just the feature of creating an invoice PDF. It also helps, if you still create an invoice PDF, it helps to think about what will be in there. Like if it's for tax purposes, then it needs to have, I don't know, it can't be just a payment receipt. It needs to have a proper invoicing number and date and stuff like that. So that might change how you implement that thing. Still, a user story is not a different format for requirements. If we just take the requirements that many companies present to me before they transition to an agile, a more agile way of working, they show me things like, update the database, add a table to the database, change the color of the UI button, add a calculation for tax XYZ or something. These are all things we need to do, we might need to do, but these are not user stories. And trying to take something like adding a table to the database or adding a field in a database table, if you try to put that into the user story format, it will be pretty hard. It will be very hard, frankly, because who's the role in that? Like, why do we add a field to the database? Who wants that? Okay, me as a developer, I want that, or me as a product owner, but that's not a valid role in a user story. There should be an end user role, a stakeholder role, like customer service, like our end users, like, I don't know, consumers or businesses, whoever we have there. They should be, maybe a teacher, maybe an accountant. These should be in the role, not the developer, the product owner. These are not valid roles. Or the system. I sometimes read as the system, I want something. No, it needs to be real people here. Or at least if you're talking about systems, if you're developing APIs, still think about the real people behind the APIs. Exceptions. Yeah, maybe if you have an exception, let me know. Eager to learn about that. And by the way, let me check the chat, because I'm not sure whether I can see the chat here. So that I can see the comments if you write them and can respond to them. So If user stories are not just a different way to write requirements, what are they then? And how do you get to user stories from your backlog that you might already have with tasks in them or with items? And for that, we have to understand the fundamental shift that user stories make. User stories are not just about how you write things down. It's just a helpful way to do it, but you can totally write in a different format. It would also be great. The thing is that user stories, and that's important, user stories are a story your user could tell. That's why they are called user stories. So it's just a story your user would tell. Pardon me. Your user wouldn't tell you to add a field to a database. They might not even know that a database is involved. A user also wouldn't tell you something about parts of your car, something a sensor wants to communicate with another sensor. They don't even care. They care about that the car is safe, or that it's fast, or that the entertainment system is great. So you want to connect it to the real users. In that, user stories help us to transition to a more design thinking way of looking at things. In design thinking, empathizing with the user is very important. Empathizing with the people who are involved, who want to get their jobs done. This is what we want to focus on. And this is also an agile principle. We want to focus on customer value. We want to increase customer value, not shareholder value. That is following that. But the most profitable companies in the world focus on customer value, not on shareholder value first. Shareholder value will come. And this is why they are the most valuable and profitable companies in the world. Because if you focus on customer value, shareholder value will follow. But if you just focus on shareholder value, you might make bad decisions. So user stories should be a story that your customers or that the stakeholders could tell. In that sense, adding a field to the database is not a valid user story. However, you put it in a different format. The user story here might be that as a customer, I can use my credit card to pay for the book. That's a user story. And yes, that might include things like adding fields to a database, like adding a colorful button. All these things, adding translations, all that might be involved. But keep user stories user stories. The check here is that a user story, it should always, when you develop it, when you implement it, you should always be able to take that, present it to a customer, and get meaningful feedback. So if you add the pay by credit card functionality to a hypothetical web shop, and you present that to the customer, and then they go, oh, well, yes, great. Now it's not only PayPal. I can also use my credit card now to pay. Wonderful. But please, I have an American Express card, and no, you just offer Visa and Master. So please, it's only useful for me if you add that. Oh, that was valuable feedback that we got. Now it fulfilled its purpose. It elicited feedback from our customers so that we can create even more value for them. Maybe they even say, yes, credit card is great. I can use that, but I want to use, I don't know, Apple Pay, Google Pay directly. Okay, more feedback. That's great. Or your customers might tell you, oh, we don't even have a credit card, or we are a group of people, so we don't have, it's difficult with a credit card. Can we do something else? Again, you're learning to create more value for the customer. But none of that would happen if you would show your customer the edit field in the database or the differently colored button. They can tell you that the button now looks nicer or whatever, but that's not meaningful feedback. In some applications it might be, but in most it isn't. And the field in the database certainly is, I mean, you can show them a database schema and they will just, I don't know, they will walk out on you and leave the interview or the review. So think about that. User stories are a different way to describe, a different way to look at what we need to do. It's not so much about tasks and work packages. User stories are about what generates value for the user. And you cannot simply, in most cases, you cannot simply convert a list of work packages, issues, whatever you call them, tasks from the past, one-on-one to user stories. You cannot do that. It's not possible. You have to think about that in a different way. Of course, you can still use your learnings that you had, that caused you to create these tasks, and then create user stories from that. But essentially, it means taking the learning, nuking what you had before, or archiving it. You don't need to delete it nowadays. We have storage, plenty of storage. Just get it out of the way, and then start with user stories that really tell stories that a user would tell. Through the eyes of the user. You have to look at your product through the eyes of a user. Make your users awesome. A great Kathy Sierra book. Go buy that. It's awesome. It's Making Users Awesome. Badass, it's called. Badass. Making Users Awesome. And it's about focusing on the user. It's in design thinking. It's what all the valuable companies in this world do. And user stories are supposed to help you with that. But if we just rephrase tasks and try to hammer them into that format, it's going to feel awkward. And many people complain about that. Oh, the user story format doesn't fit because I cannot fit that task in there. Yes, that's a feature of the format. It's supposed to tell you something if it's difficult. If it's difficult to write a user story, you might have to take a step back and think about it differently. That's a feature of the format. So it's a story your user can tell, not a different format to just convert your traditional requirements. That's the first big misunderstanding. And please use the comments. I hope I can see them. I think I should be able to see them. If you have questions or just remarks on that. The second big misunderstanding about user stories is that they would be about writing. That user stories would be about writing, but that's simply not true. I'm asked so often to give workshops in companies. They ask me, oh, could you do a workshop on how to write good user stories? That's usually the title. How to write good user stories. And this title is already wrong. The question is wrong. How to write good user stories. The question is wrong because user stories are not about writing. Yeah, stop writing. User stories are not about writing. User stories are not a different way to write requirements. User stories are a different way of collaborating. A different way of collaborating among business and developers. And some of you might know the 3 C's that we have. We have card, confirmation, conversation, or card, conversation, confirmation. So the card part of the first C just means a user story should be brief. It should fit on an index card. You know, these old index cards that we used before we all were remotely working? These little index cards. Your user story should fit on there. The restriction of the index card, the little space you have, is a feature. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And the sad part is that once we move to tools like Jira, we no longer have that restriction. We can write pages after pages. We can write whole novels inside the description field of an issue. But the restriction is a feature. User stories are supposed to fit on an index card. They are supposed to be brief. If they are long, it's a sign that you likely misunderstood user stories. The second C, let's talk about the confirmation. Confirmation is just saying that you need acceptance criteria, like a checklist. Basically, what it says is you need to agree on when this story is finished, or otherwise it could go on forever. And different people have different understandings of when it's finished. And then someone will say, yes, I'm done with that user story. And someone else will then think, okay, if that person says it's done, then let's go with it. And a little later, you find out that it was a different done than you had in mind. You thought it would be translated to other languages already, and that person just thought, oh, it just needs to run on my machine. Okay, that would be a case of definition of done, but that person might have thought, okay, it doesn't include the complicated path of the error management. It's just the happy case here. Or the person might think, oh, it's just MasterCards and not Visa and American Express and the others. So you want to have a common understanding of when it's done. And then these are the acceptance criteria. This is the confirmation part, the second C. And then the other C, the third one, is the most important one to me, and that's conversation. A user story is not supposed to convey information from business or product management to developers. That's not what it is for. This is what traditional requirement documents are often used, yes, but this is not what user stories are for. User stories are not a way to transfer information from business to developers. Because the Agile Manifesto states, with a lot of reason behind it, they state that the most efficient and effective way to transfer information from business to developers, to the teams in general, is face-to-face, not written. Face-to-face communication. And in our remote times, I would even augment that and would say it's synchronous communication. So even if it's chatting, it's still much better than writing it down in a Jira ticket. Of course, face-to-face has some other added benefits to chatting. But I think what the Agile Manifesto actually means and what makes it effective is the synchronicity of that you can get feedback, you can ask questions, you can clarify. That's the important part. So it's not about writing long documents. That's the last C. It's about the conversation. A user story is basically a promise about a conversation in the future. It's the promise of, if we're in Scrum, then it's the promise of the product owner to sit with the developers and talk about the user story. Explain it. Answer questions. And it's also the promise of the developers to sit with the product owner before they start implementing, so that they can ask questions and really understand it. The user story is not supposed to be self-sufficient and somehow magically transfer all information from product to development. It never works. You can try that. I do that in my trainings all the time when I do little exercises where you can see how ineffective and inefficient written communication is. And so use face-to-face communication, or at the very least, use some form of synchronous communication where you can ask questions and clarify and go back and forth on it. That's the important part. Okay, so please don't write long user stories. Yeah. It's all about the conversation. And of course, user stories in practice also in the agile teams I've seen, can be longer. But that's a different kind of information that's in there. So when you discuss, when you have a conversation and you ask questions, like the product owner and the developers sit together and you are talking about this. What does the user need? What's behind that? Do we need these credit cards? Do we need PayPal as well? Do we need Apple Pay? How important is it? How fast does it need to be? You know, all these conversations. What does the user want with that? Is it going to be big sums that we have so that we run into issues with like 3D security stuff or with other things where it's, or do we have small amounts of money where we don't run into these things and we don't have to consider them, at least for now? Things like that should happen in a conversation. The developers during that conversation will form an implementation idea in their mind, how it could work, and they will ask questions to verify whether their idea would hold and what they should do next. And then during these conversations, of course, product owners as well as developers will take notes. You will write down decisions you made or questions you asked and that were answered, and you will note that in the user story. That's fine. That's what it's for. And then the user stories can get longer. But the important point is that the user story description is not used to transfer information from one person to the other. That's not its purpose. It's the only things you write down there is so that you can remember. You can remember to have a conversation on that. You can remember what you wanted to talk about, and that's usually in that one sentence of the user story format. And you can remember the things you clarified in between, and maybe even implementation ideas you have. Developers might note that. That's fine to have that in a Jira ticket, but please don't use it as an attempt to transfer information from A to B, because that simply doesn't work. There is a lot of communication theory I could get in here. But generally, people have different contexts, different experiences, different definitions in their mind. You can look at language-based, I don't know, is it called language-based computer science, where it's so important. The mistakes don't happen in the computer language. The mistakes happen in the natural language we use. And even the language within one company is different. Sometimes we even talk about customers and different people mean different things. And when we don't notice that, and we just write it down, and we have the assumption that we mean something with the customer, and the person reading it has a different understanding of customer, and we aren't even aware of these things most of the time, then they will implement the wrong thing. They will implement too much, too little, whatever. It's going to be inefficient and ineffective. So and all these contexts and the hidden assumptions that we carry, the hidden assumptions are what derails so many things. And these hidden assumptions are quickly uncovered during a conversation. This is why it's so important to stop writing when we talk about user stories. Oh, I see there are comments, but I cannot read the comments. Oh, there's something odd with how LinkedIn handles comments. I'm sorry. I can see that 2 people commented, but I cannot read the comments. This is crazy. So let me see if I can get that here. Yeah, it's just not working. There is I'm trying to get the chat in, and it's not displaying the comments. Let's keep that open and let's see whether it works if you comment. And I can get that in here. Right now, it seems I don't. But yeah, never give up. So the The third thing I want to talk about, and maybe we can recap all of the three towards the end, but the third thing I want to talk about are the user stories that are bigger than a sprint or bigger than a few days. Because there are user stories that are definitely bigger. There's the user story that started SpaceX. Like I want to have a nice image of a green plant with the red Mars surface in the background. That was to inspire people to travel to space and to inspire the space industry again. That kind of was the original user story. They since pivoted a little. Maybe we still get that shot. I don't know. We'll probably get it. Musk is crazy enough to still make that. And remember that. But the thing is that a user story can be as big as an entire project, or even more, like an entire company. That could be, that's fine. That's not a problem with the user story format. It can be that big. And I would even argue that every product that a company builds starts as a single user story. There's one user story you could attach to that. Tesla has that user story even in their mission. Like they want to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. That's their mission, and they have a reason for that. Because they don't want to kill humanity with, or they want to prevent humanity from killing itself by polluting the climate and that. And building cars is just one implementation. They also build solar cells. They build the robots. Don't ask me how they factor into that, but it's basically you describing the problem in a user story. You describe what the job's to be done. You don't describe the solution. The solution comes later. So the solution to accelerating the transition to sustainable energy might lie in solar cells. Yes. In batteries for these solar cells. Yes. To stabilize the grid and to, I don't know, help create more coverage for renewable energy. And one implementation might be cars, because a car, the individual transport sector, or what it's called then, the automotive, this is one big chunk of the pollution. I don't know if it's the biggest, I don't think so, but it's a significant chunk, okay? And it's only about to grow. And helping that to be more sustainable actually gets you to that goal. So your project could start with a user story. And then that user story is obviously too big to be a real user story. You could write it in user story format, but it would be too big. You couldn't implement that like getting a greenhouse on Mars in 3 days. Would be nice though, if we could. So you have to break it down into smaller user stories. And that breaking down is an art in itself. Non-agile teams have to learn that first. It's not easy. Yes, you could break down that into, I don't know, some people might break down getting that money shot on Mars with the greenhouse and the plant. Doing that by, yes, we need to, I don't know, build a rocket, launch it. We need to, I don't know, build the greenhouse. We need to somehow figure out how to land on Mars and something. That is all fine. But what we want to do when we are agile, and that's also what a company like SpaceX does, is we want to split that into valuable chunks. Okay, so that it's valuable to the customer already. Just building rockets by itself that could then fly to Mars is not what we want there. What we want is focusing on building rockets to go to orbit to service customers. This is already creating value. It's not the Mars journey yet, but it's already creating value. It's making the company money, and it's already validating whether we built the rockets right. So we don't plan it and then build the rockets and build the greenhouse stuff and then see it blow up on the launch pad. We just start and blow it up on the launch pad, but quickly, because we only think about that part of the value. We want to deliver value by getting satellites to orbit, by having that as a service, or by what they do with Starlink, like providing internet service from there, because that helps, but it's a valuable chunk out of that big one. It's not just like an engineer would split it. To get back to our software application, the software application can often be split in MVC pattern. Don't get into the details, but you could split it into, we need a database, we need some business logic on the server, we need a client-side user interface that we could interact with. So different layers. And if you take something like paying with the credit card to get my book, and you split that into just the server part, without the user interface, it's not creating value to the customer. It's not. Yes, is it necessary to build that? Yes, it is, but not in that form, because it's not creating value for the customer. We want to split it in a different way. Traditionally, any chunk of work is split into functional things. So it's split like that. We have the user interface layer on top, we have the business logic layer, we have the database. Let's keep it simple. It's not technically correct, but simplify it. And then what traditional companies would do, they would split it, and then they would build the database layer first, maybe in one sprint. Then they would build the business logic layer in the next sprint, and then they would build the UI in the last sprint, or in the third sprint. And that's not agile. That's just using agile terms to do waterfall implementation. What would be agile would be if we do not split it that way, but we split it this way, vertically. This is the right split. This is how we do it. Instead of saying we do the database first and then we do the business logic and then the UI, we would say, okay, let's do PayPal first. Just PayPal. Don't worry about credit cards and other payment services in the database, in the business logic. Don't worry about it. Just build the damn PayPal thing, because it's already creating value for customers that can already pay. The customers who have PayPal and want to pay like that. And we validate that the whole thing works top to bottom, or bottom to top. And then we build the next chunk, maybe the credit card stuff. Then we build the Apple Pay stuff and something. And in that way, we can build in the first sprint the PayPal implementation, and it is already creating value. It's already making money. This is what SpaceX, for example, does. They are already making money with the launches, but they are far away from flying to Mars. Still making money already with their internet Starlink service and with their ride to orbit service. Making money, and now even ride to the moon will be next thing. So they can build on that, little chunks. And at the end, that whole thing will then bring them to Mars. And then whatever the business value is behind that. If it's the inspiration for humankind, that certainly works. But I'm sure there's also other profitable things you can do once you fly to Mars and you have a ride service there. So split stories differently. I should have made that its own bullet point for today. How you split user stories. That's important. You split them vertically so that they create value. And that's the tricky part. This is what trips so many teams. When they try to get user stories down to within a sprint or usually a few days of work, They often define work packages like, okay, we add something to the database or to the business logic layer. But this is not what we mean by user stories. This is not a user story. A user story must provide value to the customer. There is also, if you want to have a deeper grasp of user stories, you can look up the INVEST criteria. INVEST. It's often called invest in your user story. And it will tell you what a good user story looks like. And to quickly go through that, first, the I of invest says that a user story should be independent of other user stories. Now that's heresy to some traditional developers. So yeah, everything is connected to everything. It's of course it's dependent. We have so many dependencies. That's what I hear often. Teams say they have so many dependencies. It's not true. You made most of the dependencies yourself. Yes, there are dependencies, and there are dependencies that we cannot get rid of, and we have to manage certain dependencies. We can decouple. There are techniques to do that. Maybe for another session. But like before you try to manage something or to optimize it, try to eliminate it in the first place. Try to remove it completely, because then it doesn't bother you anymore. You don't even have to manage or optimize it. So many dependencies are homemade because people are not using user stories. Think about it. When you think about the 3 layers that are set for a web shop, you have the database, you have the business logic, and you have the user interface. Could you build the user interface without the business logic? It's difficult. You could use certain techniques like mocking and stubbing and using just fake data to make it run. But would it then be valuable in that sense that it could elicit feedback from your customers that would actually help you to build a better product? Maybe in the form of user interaction design and user experience. Yes, it could help there, but not about the payment feature itself, because you have to use it to see whether people actually buy books on your website. They won't if it's just the UI. So it's hard. And also the database layer, you cannot use that in itself. It's dependent on the other layers to build on top so that users can actually get value out of it. So there are dependencies all over the place if you slice it like that. But if you slice it like that, the vertical slices, there are far, far fewer dependencies. Slice it like that, and maybe you just do the PayPal implementation, like I said, first. That's independent of the credit card or the Apple Pay or the Google Pay implementation. Yes, there might be things that you connect later on or that have synergies, but they are pretty independent. So that's the I of invest. And you often get, excuse me, still have a cold. And if you use user stories and really focus on the value for the customer, instead of the functional stuff, how you split it functionally, then you will automatically have far fewer dependencies. And that in itself is already a benefit, because then you can move user stories around by business value, how you see fit. You don't hear the engineer screaming, oh, but we need to do this first to get this and do this first to get this. No, you can, as a business, freely prioritize and say, oh, let's push PayPal back and use the Apple Pay because that's more valuable, we found out just in a last customer survey. So customers want Apple Pay first. Most of them use it. So yes, that's fine. Your engineers will not complain that you need PayPal first to get Apple Pay. So you are free to prioritize. It's so much more fun to build products if you have these independent user stories. And yes, I'm a guy who's working in the real world with real big corporations and also small startups, and all of them have dependencies you cannot get rid of. There will still be dependencies. Usually, I never have seen a product where there are no dependencies between the user stories. You will have some, and that's okay. Then at least just document them. That's the idea. But before you document and manage them, please make sure that you think hard about eliminating them. That sometimes can be done by having cross-functional teams. That can sometimes be done by simply having user stories. It's so, I can remember the last PI plannings that I saw, safe PI plannings, where people, and it's not about a particular company, it's basically every company does that. When they go into PI planning and they think about the dependencies, there's SAFe has that planning board that basically has the all the dependencies visualized as red string, which is a nice way to visualize that you have far too many dependencies. But this is, by the way, I just see that my stream has less lag if I use this way to stream. That's also interesting. And that's good. So they use this, and then they are proud when they found all the dependencies and have all that red string. And I stand in horror in front of these boards. I mean, the boards themselves are great because the first step to solve a problem is to see the problem and describe it. And visualizing, as we know from lean production, visualizing what you do, it gets you halfway there. It's already great to see the visual clutter of all these dependencies. But you shouldn't stop there. You should then think about how can we eliminate them. Sometimes it's because you don't have user stories. Sometimes it's because you don't have cross-functional teams. And sometimes you just need to check out techniques to break the dependencies. Jochen Apelo has great dependency breaker cards. Why has the live video ended? Let me see. I just got the message from LinkedIn that the live video has ended. I hope it hasn't for you. I hope it can still continue. Join live. Okay, it still continues. I just had to refresh. Sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to make sure that I'm not talking to myself here, and that I'm adding value for you. So the thing is dependencies. Don't document them. Make sure that you resolve them. So the I in invest stands for independent. Then the N stands for negotiable. That basically says in the user story, describe the problem, not the solution. Okay. If you negotiable means that the developers can or you can negotiate how you implement that and how exactly you build that, because it's not prescribing the solution. It's just stating the problem, and there could be different solutions to that. A very, very nice example about how that's different, this subtle difference, describing the problem versus describing the solution, is if you think about the famous design thinking example of MRI machines. MRI machines, these big medical devices where you go into that tiny tube in the middle, they put you in, and then they can scan your body for problems inside. That's a tricky thing because it's claustrophobic. It's a very narrow tube you get in there. It's not nice necessarily. There is loud clanking noises when the magnets move around, and that it can be scary to adults. But think about what that does to children. Children do not want to go in there. They are scared. And in the past, the go-to solution was to sedate the children, to actually give them some medication that they calm down and just can be put in there, which is not the greatest solution if you think about it as a parent. So they were thinking about a different solution. And the engineers came up with all kinds of solutions. The solution to kind of, can we widen that thing a little so that it still works, so that it's not as claustrophobic? Can we damp the moving parts so that it's not so loud and scary in there? Can we do things like that? This was what they were thinking about. And all these, there were great thoughts and great engineering ingenuity getting into this. But they were already jumping to the conclusions. They were thinking about the solution, and they were describing the solution, like damping parts, reducing noise, making the thing wider and stuff like that. What they didn't do was describing the problem before they even started. And this is where then design thinking comes in. This is where design thinking takes a step back and says, okay, who are the people involved here? Who's the customer? We want to empathize with the customer. We want to understand what they feel and think. And then they thought about all the stakeholders involved. There was the child being scared and don't want to get in there, but being sick or being in need of having that scan. The parents who don't want their child to get some sedation and drugs to go in there, and who really don't want a crying child that is scared and then is being shoved in there just because of some medication. And then there is the doctor who wants a clear image, needs the person to lie still because she wants to help that person. So she wants that person to lie still so that she gets clean images. Then there's also maybe the CFO of the hospital. And they bought that expensive MRI machine and they want it to be used. They want to get as many patients through that in a day as possible. And crying children who need to be calmed down and sedated first, it takes time. It's just a money question for them. These are different stakeholders and they all have their stake in it. They all have certain problems. So what the design thinkers then did was empathize with these groups, especially with the primary customer, the children. So they took a step back and they thought, okay, what do children like? What do they think? What do they not like? Really try to empathize. And then they came up, based on that, they didn't define the solution. They defined the problem. They didn't talk about which parts must be damped or become bigger in the MRI machine. They just thought about the problem and stated that. And then from that problem, they were open to find many different solutions. And they came up with a solution that was both orders of magnitudes cheaper than what the engineers all had proposed, and orders of magnitudes better in the value it delivered to all the stakeholders. And the solution was, I don't have the picture right now. Usually in trainings, I show the picture. The solution was they painted the MRI machine like a spaceship. And they told, this is not the most important part. The most important part was they told the children a story. Because they empathized with the customer and they understood children love stories. Children's like adventure. Most of them do. They like stories and they like adventure. What they did is, before they went into the MRI machine, They talked to them and they said, "Hey, in you gonna go on a mission as an astronaut. As an astronaut, you're gonna go on a space mission, and it's gonna be very exciting because you're gonna go to outer space and you're gonna explore. And but to make this mission a success, when you get out there, you have to be very still, silent, and lie still so that we don't mess up the measuring story. I don't know the actual story, what they told, but you can imagine they told them something so that lying still was part of the mission, and maybe it was an astronaut training and they were an astronaut afterwards, awarded that when they came out. So the children suddenly were excited to get into that tube, into that narrow tube. And the narrowness, as well as the clanking sounds, added to the reality of the adventure. It wasn't a problem anymore. It was suddenly a feature. And children, it doesn't work for everyone, but most of the children actually went in there without sedation, without crying first. They were lying still, so it just took one pass and not many passes for the doctor to get good images. That's how it worked. And that solution with the storytelling and a little added paint to make it nicer. That was it. That was far cheaper and far more valuable. But you can only achieve that when you focus on the problem and you do not jump to conclusions prematurely. And I know what I'm talking about. I'm an engineering mind myself. I'm a master of computer science. So during my years of the master's degree, you learn to think like an engineer, really, okay? You learn to basically jump to conclusions, to solve things with the tools you have. And you look at the mechanical problem, at the engineering problem. And that is not always the best solution. So take a step back, describe the problem. User stories are about describing the problem. Now getting back to the invest criteria, the N for negotiable. If you only describe the problem, you can negotiate the solution and the exact way you do it. Like, could we do some mechanical alterations to dampen the sounds, or could we tell a story? Or even if we talk about telling a story, is it an astronaut story? Is it a submarine? Is it, do we have to paint the thing or not? That's negotiable. It's about the problem. That's the important part. So I for independent, N for negotiable. And then the next part of invest is V. V as in valuable. And we talked about that a bunch now. So it has to be valuable in itself. If it's not valuable, it's likely a task or a work package. It's not a user story. So make it valuable for the customer. That it creates value for the customer and it can elicit feedback. Then we have the E of invest. E is estimable. It's possible to estimate it relative to other stories. It's possible to say this story is bigger, maybe roughly twice as big as the other one. That means we have a good enough understanding, we have described it. If things are not estimable, there might be too much risk involved, too much uncertainty, or there might be missing information. So it's estimable. The S stands for small. Talked about that. It means you can implement it in a few days. Technically, the definition is often that it fits a sprint, which for many teams is 2 weeks. But it should be smaller than a sprint, significantly smaller. So if you just make it small enough to barely fit a sprint, you run the risk that it doesn't fit a sprint because things happen. It's just an estimation up front. So make it significantly smaller. I would say 2, 3, 4 days usually. Aim for that. Jeff Sutherland even says that the best teams, the highest performing teams, are those who get user stories really small, so that they don't even need to split them into tasks anymore. So it's just very tiny user stories. Try to do that. So make it small. And the T in the end stands for testable. That's basically rephrased acceptance criteria. So can we validate that it's actually implemented and working as intended? Is it testable? Okay. Invest. Invest in your user story. If you Google that, you will find the definition again. This invest criteria can help you to see if you have a real user story or if you just have a task in front of you that somebody somehow crammed into a user story. Especially if you see user stories that start with as a developer or as a product owner, as a system, these are all red flags. Okay? Because this is just abusing the format. The role there should always be a real stakeholder, a customer, ideally. And I started this whole invest thing, and I have to note that for next time that I talk about invest and splitting separately, because I was talking about epics. Like, what if your user story is too big? Like the money shot of a greenhouse with a green plant and the red Mars backdrop in the background. That's just to inspire mankind to go to space. That is just too big for a few days. So you split it into smaller things. And these two big stories, they are simply called epics. That's it. That's an epic. You don't need to learn anything new. Once you understand user stories, you already know epics. Epics are simply user stories that are too big. So if you take the invest criteria, it's all the invest criteria over again, but not the S for small. It's just big. It's invet instead of invest. That's an epic. To make that clear, an epic also should be independent, it should be valuable, should be negotiable, it should be testable. I don't know. I'm thinking about whether it should be estimable. If it's not small enough, sometimes it can be hard to estimate. Usually we can estimate epics relative to other epics that we already did. But I don't know if that's really necessary for an epic. So maybe it's not invet, but it's invt that you would have here. So an epic is just a big user story. Why is that so important? It's important because I see epics used completely differently in practice. At least in the practice that doesn't work. I sometimes see epics as categories. Like there is a bug epic, like all the defects are in one epic, and then there's a a user epic, which is all stuff about user management. There's a payment epics, all stuff about payment. These are not epics. These are categories or tags or whatever you want to call them. It's okay. Themes, but it's not epics. If a user story is a little short story that your user could tell, the epic is just the epically big story or a big novel that a user would tell. It still delivers value. And just user management in itself is, it's difficult. It's also never finished. That's the truth for a category or a tag, usually. If you say payment, it's never finished. I mean, you can say, okay, we have the first version of payment where you can pay with PayPal, and then we will add credit cards and something like that. And then you think you are finished with payment. And then crypto comes along and your customers demand it and you need to implement that. So basically that epic would stay open forever. And that's not what an epic is. It needs to be testable. It needs to be finishable at a certain point. You need to be done with it at a certain point in time. And you need to figure out whether you're done with some kind of acceptance criteria. On the epic level, that could be different. That could be outcome oriented, more outcome oriented, like where you say, okay, we changed our conversion rate, or conversion rate goes up by at least 10%, something like that. But still, you need to, at a certain point, say, okay, this epic is done. That's so important. So you can, epics are not categories. Okay. You can have categories. I don't care if you have user management category, payment category, defects category. That's okay. Do that. If it helps you organize, by all means do that. It might even help with capacity allocation. But don't confuse that with an epic. And the other corollary out of what I said about epics is that there is not only one layer of epics. It's not that you have one layer of epics and then below that one layer of user stories. That's not possible. This is not how the world works. If you try to force it into that, it becomes difficult. Sadly, some tools force you to think like that. But an epic generally is everything that's bigger than a few days. So you could have an epic that is a month of work, roughly. You could have an epic that is a year of work, roughly. These are valid epics. And there is no reason why you couldn't take that year-long epic and split it into smaller month-long epics that all fulfill the invest criteria, provide value, are independent, and so on. And then split those into smaller epics of maybe 3 weeks to 3 weeks. And then split those into smaller things that are then finally user stories. So it's even, you cannot tell whether something is an epic or a user story until you think about how long it takes to implement it. So that's the thing, when real agile tools, you enter something in the user story format, and you don't care whether it's an epic or not yet. When you come to, sometimes you know upfront, sometimes you know things are big, like going to Mars. It's epically big. But yeah, maybe you also know that about payment in general, the payment feature. But for some others, you might not know it. And then you just state it as a user story. Why should you decide now whether it's a story or an epic? There's no reason to do that. And then once you go to refinement and you talk to the team, you have the discussion that we talked about, the 3 C's, the conversation, you talk about it, and you figure out, and you do an estimation, and you figure out, oh, this is pretty big. We might have to split it further. Okay, then it's an epic. It wasn't a user story, but that's okay. You don't know upfront. You have to do that. You have to have the conversation. And then you find out, oh, it's bigger, and then you split it. And sadly, some tools don't easily allow you to switch from epic to story and vice versa. And just keep it open until you do the refinement. They force you to decide, do you want to create an epic or do you want to create a story? So conceptually understand that there are multiple levels of epics. You could have a big epic that splits into smaller epics, that then splits into even smaller epics, that then splits into things that fit, that could be implemented in a few days, which would then be user stories. Okay, so that's the third misunderstanding. Now, let me recap the whole thing. Still cannot read the comments though. I have to figure that out. I might have to do a few test live streams. Hopefully some of you will participate to just figure out these technical issues. For the user stories. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, I just a few days ago, I wrote an article about that on the Agile Compass, so that you can see it here. The Agile Compass is a free newsletter for Agile practitioners. So you can go there, sign up. You will also find that in my LinkedIn profile. There's a link there. And there's also an article. There was an article in the archive about user stories and writing user stories that talks a little bit about the stuff we also talked about today. So check that out. And to recap all the stuff we talked about today. So I said it's 3 big misunderstandings about user stories. And then I added kind of 2 more. I snuck them in there. First, it's not a different way, a different format for requirements. That's not its purpose, to just rewrite your requirements that you already have in the user story format. It will be difficult if you try to do that. It will be very difficult. And so that's a sign that you're not supposed to do that. User stories are a story your user could tell. It's seeing the world through the eyes of the user, describing the problem, not the solution, and not getting into functional tasks that you need to do. The second thing was that user stories are not about writing. User stories are a new way to collaborate. It's not a new way to write. User stories are supposed to be brief. It's usually 1 sentence plus acceptance criteria. That's it. If you find yourself writing novels in Jira, in that description field, and sadly that allows it, or maybe not sadly, Jira is just a neutral tool. It tries to allow you however you want to use it. But many people think they have to write a lot. Then that's not a good way to do it. It's, there's so many inefficiencies, hidden assumptions, communication problems. User stories are not about writing, okay? Do not write. Do not write. Talk. A user story is a promise for a conversation between product owners or product management and the team, the developers. And by developers, if you're not having a software product, that generally means everyone building a product. Could be people building a car. And the third thing was epics. Epics are not a category or some mystical thing. It's just a big user story. A user story that's too big to implement right away. And you have to split it further. And when we talked about epics, we also talked about splitting, because splitting user stories is an art. Because you don't want to split them in a functional way. Like, okay, if we want to have the payment feature, we want to have the database, and then the next thing would be to have the business logic and then the user interface. That's not what we want. We want to split it in that vertical way. We want to have the PayPal functionality, then we want to have credit cards, then we want to have Apple Pay, Google Pay. This is the way we want to split it, so that the thing in itself delivers value. Remember, SpaceX still didn't get that greenhouse to Mars, but they split their mission into chunks that create value, like delivering internet satellites for Starlink and making money like that, or just offering ride service to orbit. So it split it into valuable chunks. And during the splitting, we also talked about the invest criteria. And you can Google that. We talked at length about that. And with that, I'm going to leave you today. Again, apologies for the technical hiccups at the beginning. I will try to figure that out. It's not that easy to live stream on LinkedIn, I can tell you. I mean, I've been live streaming on TikTok for a long time, and it's just as easy as whipping out your phone and starting streaming. But LinkedIn is a little more involved. And it seems I still haven't figured it out completely. So bear with me. I will try more of these live sessions. And I hope, despite the hiccups and all that, you get value out of this session. Let me know if you do, and let me know if you don't. Let me know what you missed from the session. Let me know what you learned from the session. At least I know I can read the comments afterwards somehow. It's still awkward on LinkedIn, but I can read them. And for next time, I will make sure that I get the comments right away when you put them there, so that I can, I'm just checking the comments, so that I can then react to them right away and you can influence this session. Thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of the day wherever you are on this planet, and see you next time. And maybe see you on the Agile Compass on that free newsletter with articles for Agile practitioners. Goodbye.